Hey class, this is Mr. Clark, and these are the video lecture notes for History 17B, Chapter 26, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, 1932 to 1941. Next slide. There's kind of a visual overview of the chapter. The first chapter heading is entitled The Rise of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt was a wealthy, well-educated, and popular politician whose history of polio made him a more sympathetic figure to the public. Next slide. Roosevelt did not share any specifics of his plan to bring the country out of the Great Depression, but his attitude of optimism and possibility contrasted strongly with Hoover's defeated misery. Next slide. The 1932 presidential election was never really in question, and Roosevelt won in a landslide. Here's a map that shows you that Roosevelt basically swept the country in the electoral vote. Next slide. During the 4-month interregnum, however, Americans continued to endure President Hoover's failed policies, which led the winter of 1932-33 to be the worst of the Depression. Next slide. When Roosevelt took office in March 1933, he infused the country with a sense of optimism. Next slide. He still did not have a formal plan, but rather invited the American people to join him in the spirit of experimentation. Next slide. Roosevelt did bring certain beliefs to the office. The belief in an active government that would take on direct action on federal relief, public works, social services, and direct aid to farmers. Next slide. The next heading is entitled The First New Deal. After assuming the presidency, Roosevelt lost no time in taking bold steps to fight back against poverty and unemployment plaguing the country. Next slide. He immediately created a bank holiday and used the time to bring before Congress legislation known as the Emergency Banking Act. Next slide. This act allowed federal agencies to examine all banks before they reopened, thus restoring consumer confidence. Next slide. He then went on in his first historic 100 days to sign numerous other significant pieces of legislation that were geared towards creating jobs, shoring up industry and agriculture. Next slide. He sought relief to individuals through both refinancing options and direct handouts. Next slide. Not all of his programs were effective, and many generated significant criticism. Next slide. Overall, however, these programs helped to stabilize the economy, restore confidence, and change the pessimistic mindset that had overrun the country. Next slide. The last heading of this section is entitled The Second New Deal. Roosevelt won his second term in a landslide, but that did not mean he was immune to criticism. Next slide. His critics came both from the left and from the right. Here's Huey Long and Father Conklin. Next slide. Conservatives were deeply concerned over his expansion of government spending and power, and liberals were angered that he had not done more to help those still struggling. Next slide. Adding to Roosevelt's challenges, the Supreme Court struck down several key elements of the first New Deal, angering Roosevelt and spurring him to try to stack the court in his second term. Next slide. Still, he entered his new term with unequivocal support of the voting public, and he wasted no time in beginning the second phase of his economic plan. Next slide. While the first New Deal focused largely on stemming the immediate suffering of the American people, The Second New Deal put in place legislation that changed America's safety net for good, including the Social Security Act. Next slide. And that's it for chapter 26.